On a cold, rainy evening, a pregnant woman and her loyal dog walked into a corner store, just hoping to buy a few essentials. Instead, they were met with judgment, suspicion, and accusations. What happened next would shock everyone, and it was all caught on camera. Welcome to Just Dark, where we bring stories inspired by real-life experiences to shed light on injustice and foster understanding. If you believe in the power of stories to spark change, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thought-provoking tales. Now let's get into it. Meet Jasmine Brooks, a 29-year-old widow who had always been a fighter. Life hadn't been kind to her recently. Losing her husband to a tragic accident, mounting medical bills, and eviction had left her homeless. Pregnant and alone in a city where she had no family, her only source of comfort was her loyal dog, Shadow. Despite her struggles, Jasmine held on to hope, determined to make it through another day. On this particular evening, with just a few dollars in her pocket, she walked into Maria's corner store, a small shop on the south side of the city. She had no idea that this simple errand would turn into a moment that would forever change her life, and the lives of those who witnessed it. It was a cold, damp evening, and the city streets glistened under the pale glow of streetlights. Jasmine Brooks pulled her tattered coat tighter around her swollen belly, her breath visible in the frigid air. Shadow, her loyal brown mutt, walked closely by her side, his leash a simple piece of rope tied to her wrist. Jasmine's steps were hesitant as she approached Maria's corner store, the familiar bell above the door jingling softly as she entered. The scent of stale bread and cleaning supplies filled the air, a stark contrast to the crispness of the night outside. The shop was small, lined with shelves stocked with essentials, canned goods, boxed cereal, cleaning products. The items were neatly arranged, but everything had the feel of a place struggling to stay afloat, much like the people who walked through its doors. Jasmine glanced around, her nerves tingling under the weight of the stares she could feel on her. The worn wooden floor creaked beneath her, adding to the quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. Maria, the shop owner, stood behind the counter, her expression unreadable, eyes sharp and calculating. Jasmine swallowed her pride, determined to get what she needed and get out as quickly as possible. Her fingers brushed over a loaf of bread, the simple comfort of it reminding her of the small joys she used to enjoy, meals shared with her late husband, mornings when things felt like they could be okay. She placed it in her basket with a practiced hand, then added a small carton of milk and a can of soup, enough to keep her going for the night. Shadow stayed close, his nose twitching at the sense of the store, but Jasmine tugged gently on the leash, silently pleading with him to behave. She wasn't here to make trouble, just to buy a few things for dinner and move on. But Maria, behind the counter, wasn't looking at her like a customer. To Maria, Jasmine was a problem, someone who didn't fit the usual image of a paying customer. Her worn coat, messy hair, and tired eyes told a story that Maria didn't care to understand. Jasmine could feel it, the judgment in the air, the quiet assumptions that hung between them like a thick fog. Without a word, Maria's hand reached for the phone, dialing a number with quick, practiced fingers. "I think we've got a shoplifter," Maria whispered into the receiver, her voice barely audible. "She's got a basket full of stuff, but something's not right. Yeah, she's wearing that coat, the one that's seen better days. I think she's hiding something." Jasmine's stomach twisted as she overheard the call. She wasn't surprised, she'd felt it before. She had walked into this store, invisible and judged, as if the weight of her circumstances was a mark against her. She had nothing to hide, but in this moment, she knew her appearance was enough to make Maria suspicious. Moments later, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, it wasn't the soft chime of a customer entering, it was the arrival of Officer Brad Miller. His boots thudded heavily against the tiled floor, a loud, deliberate sound that echoed through the small shop. His gaze scanned the room briefly before locking on Jasmine, his eyes sharp with authority. "Ma'am," he barked, his voice cold and unwavering. "Put the basket down and show me your bag." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening as she froze. The force of his tone hit her like a slap. I haven't done anything wrong," she stammered, clutching the basket protectively to her chest. Brad's eyes narrowed, scanning her face, her hands, then the basket. "You look like you've got something to hide," he said, his voice full of accusation. "Hand over the bag now." The words stung, but it was his tone, the blatant assumption, that made Jasmine's breath catch in her throat. Her palms grew slick with sweat as she shook her head slightly. "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to buy some food. That's all." But Brad didn't listen. His gaze flicked to her bag again, then back to her face before he reached for it. Shadow, sensing the growing tension, growled low, his hackles raised in instinctive protection. Jasmine's heart raced as her dog barked fiercely, stepping forward with a protective stance. The officer stumbled back, surprised by the dog's sudden movement, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster as a wave of unease washed over him. Customers who had been quietly watching began to stir. Phones came out, cameras clicking on as they captured every moment. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension to open confrontation. Murmurs rippled through the store, the customers no longer passive bystanders. Jasmine could hear voices, low at first, then growing louder. "Is this really happening?" one woman whispered, her phone trained on the scene. "She didn't do anything." Another voice, a man standing near the aisle, added, "Why are you treating her like that? She's just trying to buy food." But Brad didn't relent. He glared at the growing group of customers, his jaw clenched, but the rising tension was undeniable. Jasmine's hands shook as she held the basket, her gaze flicking between the officer and the customers now recording the scene. Shadow stood firm at her side, barking again, louder now, his protective instincts in full force. Jasmine could feel the heat of the moment, the way everything around her seemed to grow sharper, more urgent. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at the officer. "Please, I'm not stealing. I just need help." But the moment had already shifted. It was no longer just Jasmine against the officer, it was the beginning of something bigger. It was the moment the world started to see her. Shadow's growl deepened, a primal sound that reverberated through the small store like a warning shot fired into the air. His body was tense, muscles coiled and ready as he positioned himself squarely in front of Jasmine. His loyalty and instinct were undeniable. The growl grew louder, more guttural, filling the space with an undeniable force. He wasn't just protecting Jasmine. He was standing guard, demanding respect, making it clear that no one was going to harm his person or his family. The air seemed to thicken around them. Time slowed as all eyes in the store shifted toward the scene near the bread aisle, where the confrontation was unfolding. It wasn't just a simple exchange anymore, it was something much bigger. Officer Brad's eyes flickered nervously as he felt the weight of the moment. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching with aggression. His posture was rigid, but there was something else in his gaze, something that betrayed his nerves. Jasmine's fear was palpable, but it wasn't just fear, it was a quiet fire that burned behind her eyes. "Control your dog or I will." Officer Brad barked, his voice dripping with authority, his patience already worn thin. Jasmine stepped back instinctively, her hand tightening around Shadow's leash as if that might somehow calm the situation. Her breath came out in shaky, uneven gasps, but her voice, though small, carried a force behind it. "Please, he's just scared," she whispered, but there was more strength in her words than she realized. "I'm scared. We haven't done anything wrong." The store went dead silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the faint rustling of customers shifting in place, unsure of what to do. The walls of the small corner store suddenly felt like they were closing in, but Jasmine stood there, shoulders back, holding on to Shadow as if her grip alone could keep the injustice at bay. At first, the customers had been hesitant, their eyes flicking between the officer and Jasmine. But now, the quiet tension had turned into something else, something heavier. They weren't just passive bystanders anymore, they were witnesses. Phones were pulled out, cameras activated, and suddenly, everyone in the room was a part of the story. From the corner of the store, a young woman in her 20s, her hands trembling slightly, raised her phone to record. "This isn't right," she whispered to the man beside her, her voice urgent but filled with the weight of the truth. "She's not doing anything." Brad's patience was gone, and his demeanor turned from cold to menacing. He stepped closer to Jasmine, pointing directly at her with a forceful finger. "I said, hand over the bag. I don't want to hear excuses," he spat, his words laced with contempt. But before Jasmine could respond, a new voice broke through the tension, a middle-aged man standing by the cold drink aisle, his arms folded across his chest. His voice was calm but loud enough to make Brad hesitate for the first time. "Hey," he called out, the defiance in his tone sharp and clear. "What are you doing? She hasn't done anything wrong." Brad shot him a venomous look, his jaw tightening, but the man wasn't deterred. He took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with righteous anger. "She's got a basket of groceries, not stolen goods. You don't even have evidence. Why are you treating her like a criminal?" His words hung in the air like an undeniable truth. The young woman with the phone, emboldened by the growing crowd, added with quiet determination, "I'm recording this, officer. Everyone here can see what's happening." The store was no longer silent. The murmurs began rising like a wave. A few other customers, once passive and uncertain, now spoke up, their phones held high, their voices raising in support. "She's just buying food. Why are you harassing her?" one man asked, his voice trembling with indignation. Another woman muttered, "This is ridiculous. We all see it." Jasmine's heart swelled with emotion. Her breath hitched as her eyes began to fill with tears. "I just wanted to buy some food," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of it all. Her words were small, barely audible over the hum of the growing crowd, but they cut through the tension like a blade. Brad's posture faltered as the room seemed to close in around him. His gaze flickered from Jasmine to the customers, then to the cameras. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on him, and for the first time, his certainty wavered. He hesitated, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers, each one standing firm in their belief that Jasmine was being wronged. His stance shifted, his hand moving away from his holster as the power dynamic began to shift. Shadow, still standing firm, slowly lowered his growl, but his eyes remained locked on the officer. The message was clear: "You'll have to get through me first." The dog's protective presence was unwavering, his loyalty undeniable. And then the room changed. The narrative Brad had created in his mind began to unravel. The quiet, unnoticed customers became her advocates. Phones were held high, capturing the moment for the world to see. It was no longer just Jasmine alone in this confrontation. She had an army of voices supporting her, demanding answers, questioning authority. The truth was becoming louder than the lies. Jasmine's grip on Shadow's leash tightened, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of solidarity. She had no idea how this would end, but in that moment she knew she wasn't alone. The crowd, the eyes of the witnesses, were now her strength. And no matter how hard the officer tried to hold on to his prejudice, the tide had already turned. The video didn't take long to spread. By the next morning it was everywhere, shared on social media, replayed on news networks, and dissected in online forums. The clip, shaky but clear, showed everything: Officer Brad's harsh tone, Shadow's protective growls, and Jasmine's tearful explanation as customers rallied to her defense. The caption on the original post read, "Pregnant, homeless, and black, treated like a criminal for buying food. Is this the America we want?" Within hours, the video had garnered millions of views. Comments poured in, a mix of outrage, heartbreak, and calls for justice. People were furious, not just at the officer's treatment of Jasmine but also at Maria, the shopkeeper, who had stayed silent as the situation escalated. Maria's corner store became the epicenter of protests. People left negative reviews online, accusing Maria of profiling and discrimination. Protesters stood outside her store holding signs that read, "Racism has no place here," and "Justice for Jasmine." The shop saw a sharp decline in business, forcing Maria to confront her actions. In a tearful interview with local news, she admitted, "I made an assumption about Jasmine based on how she looked, and I was wrong. I'm sorry for the pain I caused her." Officer Brad wasn't spared either. The police department was inundated with complaints, demanding his suspension. A spokesperson issued a statement promising an internal investigation. Soon after, Brad was placed on administrative leave, but the damage to his reputation was done. Community leaders called for mandatory bias training for all officers, using this incident as a catalyst for change. For Jasmine, the response was overwhelming. Strangers reached out to offer help, moved by her resilience and the bond she shared with Shadow. A local nonprofit arranged temporary housing for her and Shadow, ensuring she had a warm, safe place to stay. Donations poured in, enough to cover medical expenses for her pregnancy and give her a fresh start. But it was the outpouring of kindness from everyday people that touched Jasmine the most. A lawyer volunteered to represent her pro bono, helping her file a complaint against the police department. Families sent letters of support, and local businesses offered her employment opportunities once she was ready. Sitting in her small, newly furnished apartment a few weeks later, Jasmine stroked Shadow's fur as he rested his head on her lap. "We made it, buddy," she whispered. Her voice was soft, filled with gratitude and hope. For the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt like the future was hers to reclaim. Weeks after the incident, Jasmine sat on the small balcony of her new apartment, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. Shadow lay at her feet, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor whenever she glanced his way. The city stretched out before her, the sounds of car horns and distant chatter blending into a steady hum. For the first time in months she felt a sense of stability, a fragile but comforting feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to look up. but her mind often drifted back to that night at the store. The memory still felt raw, like an open wound that hadn't fully healed. She could still hear the officer's cold demand, still feel the weight of Maria's accusing gaze. Jasmine knew she hadn't done anything wrong, yet in their eyes she had been guilty from the moment she walked through the door. "Why is it so easy for people to judge?" she murmured, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. He looked up at her, his dark eyes full of loyalty and understanding. As the weeks passed, Jasmine's belly grew rounder, and the time for her baby to arrive drew nearer. Despite the challenges she faced, there was a new lightness in her step, a quiet strength that had been born from the kindness and support of the community. She had a place to stay now, and she was no longer walking alone. She had her baby girl on the way and Shadow, her ever-loyal dog, by her side. She called the doctor, and within moments the pain grew unbearable. Shadow seemed to sense her distress, his eyes never leaving her as she breathed through the contractions. With each wave of pain, Jasmine whispered to him, "It's okay, buddy. We're going to make it through this." The dog nuzzled her hand, offering what little comfort he could. He'd been with her through the darkest times, and now he would stay with her through this moment of transition, this new chapter of her life. At the hospital, it was Shadow who kept Jasmine calm as she awaited her turn. He sat at the foot of her bed as if guarding her, his presence grounding her amidst the flurry of nurses and doctors. Jasmine was nervous, but knowing Shadow was there made everything feel just a little less daunting. When the time came for her to push, Jasmine's world narrowed to a single focus: the child she had carried for months, the daughter she had dreamed of holding in her arms. The pain was sharp, intense, but with each breath she found strength she didn't know she had. And then finally the room grew quiet, and Jasmine heard the soft cry of her baby girl. The doctor placed her in Jasmine's arms, her tiny body wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Tears filled Jasmine's eyes as she looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and pride. Through it all, Shadow was there, standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes gentle but watchful. Jasmine could almost feel his pride too, like he knew somehow that she had made it through. She hadn't done it alone. She had her baby, and she had Shadow, who had been her strength through every trial. As she cradled her baby girl, Jasmine whispered softly, "We made it, baby. You and me. And Shadow too." The dog gave a small whine as if in agreement before sitting down at her feet. In that moment, surrounded by the love of her newborn daughter and the unspoken bond with her dog, Jasmine realized something important. Life had been hard and the world hadn't always been kind to her. But she wasn't defined by the hardships she faced. She was defined by her resilience, her love for her daughter, and the deep, unbreakable connection she shared with Shadow. As she looked down at her sleeping baby, Jasmine smiled. This was just the beginning. Life was still uncertain, but she had her dog, her strength, and a community that had shown her she wasn't alone. Shadow nudged her hand with his nose and she laughed softly. "We'll be okay," she said, more to herself than to him. And for the first time she truly believed it. Thank you for joining Jasmine's journey. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's hope, kindness, and the strength to rise above. Have you ever seen someone unfairly judged? Share your story in the comments. If you believe in the power of stories to inspire change, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more powerful stories like Jasmine's. We can't wait to share the next chapter with you. The only way to deal with this life meaningfully is to find one's passion and give everything to it. Viktor Frankl.